Hello, here we are with a new video, the second part of the refactoring from function to classes for UI components. And if you haven't watched the first video, you might want to watch that one. But this one is basically a more finalized version of the refactoring. That basically I created a new component, the Mambo tab, and basically based on this exercise of creating a brand new component, I made some more changes to the design pattern on the class for UI components. So I added to the project a file, Mambo UI template.js, which is basically a bare bones class, Mambo template class, and that basically shows you the basic structure of how a reusable UI component is written. So I'm going to break this down in details, very detailed video, and then I'm going to refactor the Mambo input, which is currently a class. I'm going to refactor this in, it's a function, and I will refactor it into a class right here in this video so you can see the process as well. So to understand why this design pattern, why we have to do it the way we're doing it here, is because we have three ways to consume, three ways to use our components, and that's the real reason. Otherwise it will be more similar to how it is right now, a regular function. And so we have three ways of consuming now a UI component, because we are making them native, right? We are defining our classes as native web components. And so this means that they can be used in two more different ways. So once a Mambo template or a class or any UI class is defined, and remember that for this to work, you have to extend the HTML element, but this is only for UI components. If it's not a UI component, it's not a native web component, then you don't extend HTML, and this design does not apply to that case. This is only for web components, native web component design. And so what happens here is, when you have a native web component, which means you can create an instance of that web component directly in the HTML without using JavaScript. And the way that works is you literally come into the HTML and you would open a tag. So this one will be called Mambo template, just like that. So this is creating an instance of that web class, the web component. The other way of creating an instance, and I will do it right here inside the script tag, is I don't have to declare a variable to do it, so I'm going to do it like this. So when you do a document create element, so this is also creating an instance of that. And typically what you would do here, you would save it to a variable. So now we have the instance of the Mambo template. And what you would do is, let's say we want to install it inside the app. Let's give this an ID. App body. and we're going to install it in here. So what you do is so this is the process. You create your instance, but you have to append them to the DOM. With the native web component, when you write your HTML tag like this, you are installing, you're creating a new instance and automatically installing that in the DOM in whatever part you need it to be. So in this case, it could be more like that. Right, so now we have that instance of the Mambo template, and then this would create a second instance and install it in app body. And so this is this way of working now with native components is what forces us to do our class design differently, because we also want to install it in strictly JavaScript. In this way, we want to also create an instance of that component this way, and we tell it where to install it. So we tell it a parent element to install, which would be similar to this. So this app body would be in this parent tag property. So that's how it knows where to install. So that's what we have, 3 ways of using this. And so now with this, going back to this 2 ways, there is a limitation in doing it like this and doing it like this. It's a huge limitation, and that limitation is that at the moment that you create the instance, you cannot pass an object literal as a configuration for the component to install. Obviously, we have lots of logic for each UI component. We're creating dynamically a whole lot of logic, so we have to get a configuration object for each instance that we create, so we can configure it the way we need to. And so with these 2 ways, the native component, you cannot do that at the moment that you create the instance. So this creates the instance, but doesn't allow you to pass the object. This creates the instance, you install it, but it doesn't allow you to install the object configuration. So in these 2 cases, we need to employ a method to install that configuration, which is not the case for when we do it in strictly JavaScript, like so. We pass the configuration at the moment that we create the instance. But we have to make it work in the 3 different ways. So let's finally go into now the design pattern for this. So we have a class, the constructor. The constructor contains all the logic of this component, everything. You can see there are no methods defined after it, after the constructor. Everything is in the constructor. And so what we do here, we have to have logic so we can install this component both in 2 different ways. One is, the first 2 ways is that we have to call the setup method. So the setup method is this function here. And so setup will take a parameter called options, and that is the object. This object coming in here will be the same that we pass into as an argument when we create the instance this way. So from the outside, you will call setup, you pass in the options, and then we execute configure, and then we pass those options as an argument into configure. And then our function configure, which will always be at the end of the document, takes those options and then it executes the default configuration. This is the beginning of our default configuration. And then here we check one more time just in case. If options exist, then we are taking our original configuration and we're overriding it, extending it with the new options that come in. Then we do a check to see if the parent tag exists. This parent tag is this one here, which is basically where we are going to install the component. So we check if it exists in the configuration, then we're going to store it in a member variable because we will need to access that throughout the component, throughout the class, at the scope of the class. And then finally here, we do the CSS configuration, which I'm going to make a new video on this very soon, explaining the CSS configuration. And so after configure has executed, now we have the base configuration, our variable, member variable mconfig now contains all our configuration. And so now we can proceed installing. And then in the function install DOM, we have the logic where we begin dynamically creating all the HTML elements that need to be put into this component dynamically. And so at the end of that, now we have to install the component into the parent. And so we do a check and we install self into that parent tag. So now we see this property install, mconfig install, which we can see here as a default configuration. So what's happening here is that as I was working through this design, there are times that you might want to create the instance of a component, pass in the configuration, run through the entire installation, but you might not want to install it right away. And that will be the case for large components that have a lot of data, especially the grid. The grid is always one that takes hundreds of milliseconds to load if it has sufficient data to process. And so what I started to realize is that we have a design here, an environment where we are working entirely in memory. So whether we immediately install the component onto the DOM is irrelevant. Basically, all it is when I'm saying install, all it really means is that we're going to append this entire class, the self class, this entire element, which is a DOM element, it will get installed into the parent tag. That basically all it means by install. Until you added the element, the component into the parent tag, it only exists in memory inside this JavaScript application, but it doesn't exist in the DOM yet. And so that's why in the base configuration we're going to have always the parent tag will always be undefined by default. It is not required. Install will always be true. Install prepend. What that means is that when you add a DOM element, by default, the append child will add it to the end of that parent. So if that parent already has a child, then now this new element becomes a new child of that parent, so it becomes a sibling of whatever already exists. And it's always added by default to the end. But there are cases where you want to install it in the beginning, at the beginning of the parent and not at the end. So if that's the case, you can pass true for that property install prepend, pass it true, and when we install it, the install self, it will add it to the beginning of the parent. And with that in mind, so now we have, those are new props that I added here. And so when going back to the installation of the DOM, when we are finished, when we have completely finished the installation of the DOM, then we do a check if install is true. And if it is true, then we call this function install self. This install self should always go right before the configure at the bottom of the document. So then we call install self, and we pass the member variable parent tag. And we also pass the configuration install prepend. And so this function receives those two parameters. And for install, this parent tag may or may not exist yet. You might have not passed a parent tag and left it to install true. Well, in that case, what's going to happen is the installation is just not going to happen. It's simple as that. It won't install. That's a configuration error, but it's very unlikely for that to happen. So, but in this function, then we take the parent tag. We say if we have a parent tag passed as a parameter, then we use that. Else, we go after the end parent tag. And I will explain that in a moment as well. So, but let's now drill a little deeper into this. So what is happening here? So we have resolved our parent tag, and now I added a new method to DOM.js called append self to parent tag. Okay, so in that we pass the parent tag, the self, which is the self is the entire component, and the prepend boolean value. We pass it into append to self to parent tag. And so now let's go into the DOM and let's look at that. So the append self to parent tag is this very small function, really tiny. The reason why I created this function and did not reuse the append child is because I want to return the parent element if found, because remember that our environment works with all native DOM elements. Your parent tag might not be a native DOM element. It might be a string value with an ID or a class or a tag name or whatever. So this get tag function inside DOM.js is actually resolving that. Whatever you passed in as a parent tag, it will resolve it and return to you the actual DOM element. But it might not find it. So if it doesn't find it, then I want to have a return here that basically says the name of your self, which in this case will be mambo hyphen template, and it says parent tag element not found, DOM install failed. So because it returns that back on the template, now parent tag will have that value, will have this value here. And so that is a way for the developer, when they're debugging the code and trying to see what's going on, if it doesn't install, then they get the error, then they get that value. But if the parent was found, then I use the add child, right? So pass the parent element, the self, and then the boolean, whether it's going to prepend or append. And we'll return the parent element. So back to this, if our parent tag value was valid and it is found, then now the self append will append it into it and then return us that parent. Because remember, again, this parent might be a string value of an ID, and eventually we want the actual DOM element, so we wanted to get it back here. And so now we have it saved, so now we have that as well. And so what happens is we could have a case where during the installation we supply the parent tag to install, but then we set the install to false because it's a component that we might want to install later on, but we want to have it in memory all ready and good to go whenever it's needed. So that will make the application run much faster. In the background, we can prepare the component, load it, and then install it, and the installation will be super fast because everything is set already in memory. So when that is the case, where you passed a parent tag and installation is false, then now we can employ another method called install. So what install is going to do, it bypasses the configure. When you call the install method, it assumes that the configuration has already taken place. And all you're trying to do is just simply install it. So you can see when you call setup calls configure, and then it installs the DOM, and then install the DOM does the installation at the end. The install skips setup and skips install DOM function, and it goes straight into the install itself. Okay? And so when you call install, the only thing that it's expecting is the parent tag and the Boolean flag, whether you want to prepend it or append it, and that's it. And so now that's the complete design pattern of the template. And so how would that work? Going back to our two cases of creating an instance this way or this way. So at this ID, this Mambo template instance, we're gonna give it an ID of a Mambo template, right? That's our ID. And so down here, we're going to get a template element, we call it, we pass it that ID. Because we installed it, but now we need to go get it to install the configuration. So in both cases, in the case that we create the element, or in the case that we go after it in the DOM, we will call the setup method, which is here, our setup method, and it's expecting options, configuration. So that we can take, let's assume this Mambo template is a Mambo tab, right? So this is the configuration that I have here for a Mambo tab. So I'm going to copy this, bring it here into the script tag. And so now we have a configuration. Let's just call this for now config. And so now we pass the setup and we pass our configuration. And so now this instance will get installed with all the good stuff that we need in it. And then we would do the same. In this case, it's exactly the same. And it's exactly the same. So at some point, in this case, we have to run setup. The reason why the setup will work is because we already passed the parent tag element. So let's assume that this is, why don't you say app body. right? So AppBuddy already knows it will install. But this, if this does not exist, and actually this needs to be like this. It's an ID. So now if this does not exist in here in the configuration, let's assume it's not there, then after the setup, then I can do install, and we pass it where to install it. Okay, that is also doable. So in here in the setup, in this configuration, we have the parent tag is not there, and I can say install. I can say install false. So if I do this, if I pass the parent tag, then I have installed false. Then when I call the install later on, I don't have to pass the app tag. I know that it's already passed into the configuration, already configured it, but I decided not to install it because I'm going to install it later on. And so that is the design pattern for how to work with this. And like I've explained before, working the regular JavaScript way of creating an instance, now you pass the configuration directly in as a constructor. And so for this case, the third and last case, our design pattern works as follows. When you create a new instance of this class and you pass an argument, it comes in as a parameter of the constructor, init options. So luckily, because in this way, it is impossible to pass an argument into the constructor function, then we know for sure that if this init options is undefined, then we're most likely dealing with a native web component installation. And so now, but if it exists, then we know that it's an instance of a new class, it's an instance of the class created purely in JavaScript, like so, and we passed in the configuration. And so we check, we say, okay, so if we have init options, and we're here in line 18 is where we're doing the check. If we have init options, this is not a native web component installation. And so we're going to execute setup right away. We pass it that init options, and then we're going to the setup function, and it goes through the whole process exactly the same way that it does when you call the setup method. So the installation occurs through two ways, the setup or the constructor parameter. And then we're going to setup, and you already know everything is happening the exact same way. So those are the three ways of working with this design pattern, the three ways of implementing it, and that's why we have to work with this the way it is here. And so now I'm going to do a refactoring. We're going to refactor the Mambo input. And again, this design pattern is only for native web components. So this refactoring is valid only for native web components. So what we do is we start off, this is pretty quick. So we take function and the class name, we replace it with constructor. Then I'm going to select the entire function. Input, right? Oops, I forgot the extends. HTML element, and then in here we copy that constructor. So now everything in here, and that's our starting point constructor. So now this parent tag goes away. This options become init options. We don't need use strict, it's not a function anymore. We don't need to check if the parent tag does not exist. That's all news. And everything here stays the same. The immediately invoking the configure and the setup goes away. And we go into the template and we're going to bring the two public methods and this if statement. And inside setup, we need to add the property, the parameter options, and call it on configure. So I come in here, we paste that in. The methods have to be alphabetically ordered. Like so. And then our setup takes options. And here we call configure with the options. And then we go into, I'm going to copy this, go into configure. Now configure need to take that options. Okay. Options, and then if options, we're doing everything the way it was before. And now we need to take this install self and we put it right before the configure. It's going to go in the bottom. And then this install component into parent needs to happen at the end, at the very end of the DOM installation. Now in this case, you see it inside the function install DOM. But when we come to a much bigger component, let's track this down. So we have configure and we have install DOM and then set up event listeners. So we're gonna drill through the code and we're going to find the very, very last place in the installation logic to put this line of code here. Okay, it has to go at the very end. We don't want to put it here because JavaScript is a scripting language and it will run before install DOM finishes. Whatever logic there is inside install DOM, JavaScript doesn't know. It will run it, but it won't wait for that to finish before we execute this check. And so if install DOM takes too long, then we're installing this too soon. So we don't want to put it in there. What we want to do is we're going to go into install DOM. It's this function here, and we go through the logic. So this parent tag, checking this, we don't need anymore because again, we're not longer requiring that you must provide a parent tag. So we go through the logic, we keep on going and going and going. Then it does a couple of things. And then look at the end, now we have this function called finish setup. So we're gonna go into finish setup. And so this is basically what it's doing. If you wanted to know when the component finished installing, then you will pass your function there. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna put our if in here. So it goes at the very, very, very end. And now there is another part that I skipped through it purposely. Right here in the install DOM, what we were doing, or what we are doing, the function design, not the class, is that we were requiring the parent tag to exist. So here we are assuming that the parent tag exists, but this is no longer the case. So this needs to go away also. Okay, when you see that we are getting the parent tag, it's everywhere in every current component. So we eliminate that. And when that needs to be replaced with inside the config and the configure function, we need to add these properties. And we're also going to install the default theme. No, I'm not gonna go into that right now. It's for the next video. So we take this props and we go into the configure, and this needs to be added in here. And so now our parent tag is undefined. Going back to the template, see, we have this check here. So we copy that and we paste it after the extend of the option. So we have configure, here we do the extend, and after it we do the check for the parent tag. Okay? And what I'm also going to bring into Mambo input is this CSS. I'm not going to go into that right now, but I will put it in here for the next video. And this is control Mambo input. Well, I'm going to do that right now. I'm not going to go into the details, but I will add it. So now the theme goes in there. And this I have to order it alphabetically right now. It's not alphabetically, it has to be ordered. One more thing I forgot from the design pattern is the super that you have to call. Okay? Completely forgot about that minor detail there. So the first thing you do in the constructor is you call the super function. And then also we take the define, we add it to the end of the class, and we define it here. Mambo input, Mambo input. And I also bring the theme is this guy here, so we need the theme right there. And now when we look at the application, input field, there it is. So everything is working the way it was working before. Okay guys, thank you for watching. We'll be in touch.